And I was brought up in the truth. I had reasonably devout parents, very devout parents. We did our readings every day and I knew it. But that concept of doing some really good, diligent Bible study and being able to master, in inverted commas, an entire book, a whole book, it's only 2 chapters, and a book that is very simple on the surface, but very profound as well, was transformational for me. And I've never forgotten that study. And I won't say I'm an expert at it, or I have mastered it, but I haven't forgotten that work. It was a pivotal study in my life. And last year, which I think might be 30 years later, I thought I need to go back and have a look at that. And I've enjoyed every verse and every bit of it. And I want to share this with you. I think we're in for a wonderful weekend. It's ticking a lot of boxes for me. Got some really great company and people that I know and will get to know. I've got some inside information about who the cooks are, and that's going to tick a lot of boxes for me. We've got a fire at the back. I hope it rains for a lot of the weekend. I'm not a big fan of the mud, but I love being inside when it rains. And we've got an incredible discussion to look forward to. So this is something I'm really looking forward to spending with you. As you see on the slide, we've called this weekend Straight Talking for Kingdom Preparation. And that's because we're going to find out tomorrow morning that Haggai was a real straight talker. He didn't beat around the bush. He just went straight for the hard facts. He was a blunt, bullet point person. He just said it how it was. And he also, we're going to find tomorrow morning, presented a picture of warning at the close of an era when people should have been working for God. And he's saying you need to get back to basics, consider where you're going. We'll find tomorrow morning that of all of the books in the scriptures, there's perhaps not a more applicable book in our generation, in our day today, to study and enjoy and remind us of where we should be going. And we're interested in straight talking for kingdom preparation because Christ is super close. And we've just read from Ezekiel 38 with Brother Josh. Brother Carl mentioned that it's a chapter we know well, but it still stirs us, and it does, because it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And there will be brothers and sisters in this hall tonight, and maybe a few more tomorrow morning, who have heard Ezekiel 38 read for 10 and 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 and maybe 60 years. And our prophetic outlook on that chapter is as sharp as it's ever been. And the things that we've been blessed to see in the last 2 years alone have cemented this chapter in my mind. Do we believe it? Yes, we do. It's a beautiful chapter. And it tells us that Christ is coming very, very soon. Let's have a look at just this year. So we've seen a war in Ukraine. An invasion on the 24th of February of this year. Mr. Putin likes to call it a special military operation. It's not, it's a war. It was an invasion. And Ukraine was ripe for the picking, and no Christadelphian who had read this chapter was surprised at that event. Ukraine, of course, is the Magog of Ezekiel 38, Gog of the land of Magog. It's rich, it's been known as Europe's breadbasket. It's right on the boundary of Russia. And Mr. Putin said, thank you very much. And that happened just 3 months ago. Beautiful. And then we see things like this of the man's theatrics and posturing. He's a clown and he's a thug. And all images like this go to prove is that he's not just out of reality with his people, he's out of reality with the rest of the world. And we don't know whether he is a Gog. There's some interesting speculation that I'll enjoy talking about with some of you during the course of this weekend. But he is doing everything that Gog would, and he is positioning Russia to do exactly as Gog will do. He's an amazing man. And then the West has come along and put a whole lot of sanctions on Russia. may be relatively puny because they haven't yet looked seriously at energy. But all of the big four are gone. McDonald's have sold their stores. They've found a buyer, about 850 of them, I think. They haven't sold, they're selling. You can see some of the companies that have gone, including Apple, Microsoft, Nike. The Italians, of course, wanted to protect their Gucci handbags, so they wanted an exclusion for that. I don't think the Italians knew what sanctions meant. Sanctions mean you've got to be mean, you've got to be tough, you've got to see this through. Time alone will tell whether Europe and the West are up for that. And time alone will tell whether energy gets brought into these sanctions. And then, of course, we're faced with this. This is an image out of The Economist magazine. And you might see this as a handful of wheat, but if you look closely, every kernel is a skull. And I just love the way The Economist magazine does their editing, their writing, their cartoons and their images, and they nail it every single time. Because this is dire consequence, and I've got some stats. Russia and Ukraine, so invader and invaded, supply 28%, so that's just over a quarter of the world's traded wheat. The traded wheat in the entire world, over a quarter of it comes from these two countries. That's huge, isn't it? No wonder that Ukraine used to be known as Europe's breadbasket. It's where it all comes from, through its really rich, fertile soils. We'd love that in our garden. 29% of the barley that's traded comes from these two countries. 15% of the maize, 75% of the sunflower oil. And Ukraine's food exports provide the calories to feed 400 million people. You stop that and people starve and die, and that's the genesis of that illustration. And as you know, the Russians will not let the Ukrainians bring ships out of their port because they're blockaded at Odessa. And the Ukrainians have put mines in the sea to stop the Russians getting too close. Nothing's going anywhere. That is being stuck in silos. And then the Ukrainians are going to come along and they're going to say, we're going to plant some more wheat, maize, whatever, and harvest that, but they've then got nowhere to put it because the silos from last year are still full of that because it hasn't moved. And it can only be moved by boats. You can put a little bit of it on a train, a little bit of it on a truck. You can trek it out into Western Europe, but it's just a little percentage of what needs to be done. And Mr. Putin doesn't care. That is going to sit in silos and rot, and many hundreds of millions of people in this world are going to go hungry. And so during the course of this year, the ethical debates will start to come out. What's better? What's worse? Do you tolerate and support an invasion of a country? Or do you feed 100 million people? And we'll have those sorts of debates and arguments. This is affecting people worldwide. There was a classic case, which you might have read of bread in Egypt. It's a staple in Egypt. If you want to eat in Egypt, you buy bread. And because it's so important and such a huge part of people's diet, the government subsidizes bread. You go there and you pay a pittance for this bread because it's got a subsidy on it. I think it was back in the 70s that an Egyptian government risked increasing the price of bread. And there was such a riot that they immediately reversed it, and the price of bread has stayed the same ever since. Until now, price of bread's gone up. This is what's happening in Europe right now. This is the effect right throughout the world. And another huge thing that's happening, and perhaps one of the drivers for what's happening, is the expansion of NATO. And for our youngest ones, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was set up in 1949 as a defensive group. So we need to note that and always remember it. It's for defense. And there was 12 nations that comprised it after World War II, and they set up and they said, we're worried about Soviet Russia. We're worried about the USSR. So they all got together and they made a team, a NATO team, to defend them. And since 1949, the 12 has grown on the screen to 30 over that time. And interestingly, the border of NATO in 1949 has moved from the middle of Germany, where East and West Germany were, and it's moved 1,000 kilometers to the east, closer to Russia. And why have so many more people? Why have so many more countries joined? 18 more, because they're nervous, they're scared. And right now, Finland and Sweden, can't quite see the pointer there, in the north, have applied to join NATO because they're scared and they're nervous. Turkey down the bottom has tried to veto that application. So that's going to be interesting to work that through. But you can see that if these two northern areas successfully join NATO, the NATO boundary along Russia will double when they start. Now, Mr. Putin's sitting back there and he says, I don't like that. And even though they're defensive, even though they're doing it because they're scared and nervous, Mr. Putin's saying, I don't like what you're doing. I need some breathing room. I need you to push your back. So in 2008, he invaded Georgia. For the last 14 years, he's been annexing and invading. He's just moved into Ukraine, as we know, because he wants some breathing room. Doesn't like it. He wants to push it back. So we're going to watch this. Ezekiel 38 is guaranteed to be true. How does Mr. Putin align himself with Europe? We'll see. And then we've got this character, Patriarch Kirill, who's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. And these two are exceedingly close, unbelievably close. So Patriarch Kirill supports everything that Mr. Putin is doing. He says that Russia's not an aggressor. In fact, Ukraine's full of Nazis, and Russia has done the right thing, says Patriarch Kirill, the head of an Orthodox church, done the right thing by going into Ukraine to cleanse it. You imagine that. Now, Revelation 16, which we know well, speaks, doesn't it, of that three-group party at the end that will meet as part of Armageddon. The dragon, the third Rome, the military might of Rome, and then Istanbul, Constantinople, and up to Rome, modern-day Russia, and Europe, and also the false prophet, the church. How's the church, how are the Roman Catholics going to align themselves with Patriarch Kirill? We don't know, but these two are very, very, very close, incredibly close. And here's the man himself. I read an article in The Economist magazine. I recommend that magazine highly if you want some good, I think, unbiased reporting on world events. There's no fluff. There's no opinions that I can see. It's pro-America, anti-America when it needs to be. It seems to cut the line and get to the facts. And they had one gentleman who was Russian writing for them, and he used to be an oil tycoon, a hydrocarbon tycoon, and is now a political prisoner. And he wrote probably the most illuminating portion that I've read in that magazine for a long time. And he said the problem with the West and Mr. Putin is when the West meets and greets and tour, when Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush and Mr. Obama and all of and the German chancellors come together, they all act and behave as statesmen because they're educated in such a way, they're experienced in such a way, they've been taught to do that, and at home they have electorates, i.e. voters, who they've got to please. So they always act nicely. And Mr. Putin is none of that, said this correspondent. He called him a thug, masquerading as a statesman. But he's not a statesman, he's a thug. He doesn't care about his electorate, he doesn't care about his people, he doesn't care about what people think of him. And so when Mr. Bush or Mr. Obama or Mr. Trump go up and shake his hands and say, it's really nice to meet you, it's a statesman greeting a thug. And the West has only worked that out and woken up to that seriously this year. You would have heard of the historical accounts of the Western leaders. There's a classic one from Mr. Bush and says, I looked into his eyes, into his soul, and I saw a good man. I think he regrets saying that. This man is a troublemaker. He's a wicked, wicked man. Interestingly, there's reports that he's not well. So there's been some recent reports that say he's suffering from Parkinson's and cancer, and he has a routine group of doctors around him all of the time. I don't know if that's true. No one really knows if that's true, except Mr. Putin's most inner circle. But that's going to be interesting to watch as well. Is he pushing Ukraine because he's scared that his legacy opportunity is passing? Is he going to go? Is he going to be replaced by someone who then turns around the opinions of Russia and gets collaborative and starts to cooperate with Europe? We don't know. But never, ever, ever underestimate this terrible, terrible man. And then, so we've done Ezekiel 38 with that northern confederacy of Gog and its plans to take on Europe and incorporate Magog, etc., from the ancient Rus. We then come down to a very confident Israel. New Prime Minister, BAU, business as usual. Things go on. Confident. Yeah, there's a few deaths here and there, a few little Palestinians come along and killed some of us and we've killed them. Bit of stuff on the front page, but it's all business as usual. Except for this, they're standing by Ukraine. And Israel will tell you that they were one of the first to help Ukraine. They said in the first few days, they initiated their help for Ukraine in the form of aid. That's courageous, it's brave, backing anti-Russian groups. No wonder in Ezekiel 38, Gog comes down into a secure Israel and defeats it completely. Israel, who set themselves also up to be a mediator, offered their opportunities and their services in that area, they're standing up for Ukraine. And then we come further south and we see that Southern Alliance, and this is taking place as well. In the submarine alliance, the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US, that alliance, which has happened just recently, clearly to defend Asia and Western interests against China, no doubt about that, although never stated, but also clearly telling us, Christadelphian readers, that these three groups work together, collaborate together, and are the merchants of Tarshish and the lions. They will not part, they will work together. Just yesterday, I went to a demonstration at the Tonsley village with the shipbuilding yards down at Osborne. And in Adelaide, we've been known for building Collins-class submarines for many years with mixed success. The latest thing at Osborne is building not submarines, but anti-submarine warships. Apparently the best in the world, all using advanced digital manufacturing. They're very proud of that. But I did wonder whether it was lost on everyone there that we've spent all of this time building submarines, killers, and now we're building anti-submarines in the form of warships, things to kill the killers. Is this the future of the world? Is this the world that we really want to live in? There was a presentation there from Mr. John Carruthers, who's the head of state defence. And he said that in that industry, $10 billion is a rounding off error. That's where this world is putting their money. That's where America and Australia and the US are coming together because they're nervous, because they're scared of China and the rest of the world. Also in the West, in the Middle East, rather, we have further strengthening of relationships with Israel and Sudan and Sheba and Dedan there. And I just love what Mr. Putin did to cement that through the Abraham Accords. Those countries there, the UAE, Bahrain, and a number of other countries, they're getting closer and closer and closer to Israel through trade, through travel, through business, through military and strategic alliances. Why are they doing that? Because they trust Israel. Why do they trust Israel? Because Israel does stuff. America talks about stuff. They're full of diplomats and they prefer not to pull a trigger. They prefer to sit at home and talk their way through an issue. Israel just sends a missile and sorts it. And that's music to the ears of Sheba and Dedan. Because the big Iraq that's sitting over there with their potential nuclear missiles and bombs within weeks, months, or years poses a huge threat. And so they've made this alliance of Israel and the West and Sheba and Dedan come together. Absolutely beautiful. And here's the man who won't do anything. I don't really blame him. You know, he's got 250 million voters and they don't want to do much either. Bringing back body bags doesn't get you re-elected all that often. Certainly not in 2022 in the US. But he's not well. If you've seen him lately, he's an older man. With respect to our aged, he's 80 this coming November. And that's not a great age to lead the premier country in the world, which they are, both militarily, tech, GDP, all of them at the moment. They are there, but he's leading them against a country, an arch enemy who is happy to go to war, trigger happy. He's not a well man. And so when we come to Ezekiel 38, we've got that group in the Middle East and they say, well, what are you doing here? You come to take a spoil. It's not that they haven't got the resources, they haven't got the military might, they just don't want to use it. They're scared, they're nervous. They prefer diplomacy than dealing with thugs. What's he going to do? And finally, just to throw another one in, we've seen this in the last month or so. We've actually seen it a long time before that. It's no surprise, it's right around the world. The only reason we've seen this is that it's become apparent in rich, affluent Western countries, like Australia. That's why we read of it. It's been everywhere for a long time. It's brought on by people mostly men, having immoral relationships. It's another way of nature saying you've done the wrong thing. And it's gaining cases in Australia as it is around the world. But we don't have to be worried about that. The world doesn't need to be worried about that. The health experts say that that's just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, the health experts tell us some great stats that since 1940, you were alive in 1940, Brother Carl? No, sorry. Sorry. 1940, there have been 335 new and potentially fatal diseases emerged globally since 1940. 335 fatal diseases that weren't known to man before that year. And nature's having its say back. So you want to play up? You want to have fun? Well, nature will come back and get you. And we know all about COVID here tonight. It's present really in every room, in every one of us. The effects of the disease have just crippled society as we used to know it just 2.5 years ago. Know about Ebola and HIV and swine fever and bird flu, and we're still getting new strains of bird flu. But this is what the health experts are also saying. They're saying that major flu pandemics with very high mortality rates, death rates, come along roughly every 30 years or so. And they say we are long, long overdue for a really big one. And then they hypothesize and they say, well, what would happen if you got something as transmissive as Omicron and something as fatal as Ebola? What would happen then? That would be game over for a lot of humanity and global economy. So this is just a little thing. but it's illustrative, like COVID, about how little things can change the world. It's going to happen, brothers and sisters. And when you look around about what's happening, this is sort of 3 or 4 months. It's not too long, is it? And it's changed heaps of things in the world. Another article from The Economist magazine, and I just love their perception. Reading on the right there, by invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has divided the world into 3 broad categories. Governments that are West-leaning in blue, governments that are Russia-leaning in red, and neutral amid the conflict. I doubt that correspondent had read Ezekiel 38, but it wouldn't surprise me, would it? There's 2 groups. There's a pro-West one that supports Israel ultimately and is going to come down in the bottom area in the Middle East. And there's a pro-Russian one ultimately that's going to come down from the north with Gog of the land of Magog and all of those other nations, including Iraq, who has alienated Sheba and Dedan to align themselves with Israel. Beautiful. That's why Brother Carl said, we've read this hundreds of times and it still stirs us because it's just dead right. And Christ is going to come back. And I think our dear Lord Jesus Christ and our Father are sitting in heaven and saying, what further signs do you really need? You know, my grandparents, possibly your grandparents, lived to see that and didn't. Our parents as well may be seeing this. This has been on our lecture screens for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Brother Bruce used to come to my home ecclesia at Victor Harbour with his little transparencies with all the little coloured tags on them and flip things. Talk about Ezekiel 38, 40 years ago, and the message hasn't changed. God is saying, this is real, it's happening. The things that we've seen for decades, we've seen on steroids in the last 2 years. It's been beautiful. And so when we look at a couple of Bible quotes and other quotes, Daniel 12, there'll be a time of trouble such as never was. Do you believe that? I do. I really do. That's going to happen. And then and that's 2,500 years ago. I reckon every person in this room knows deep down that that's going to happen. 2,500 years ago, that one. What about this one, Luke 21? There shall be signs, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, sea and the waves roaring. 2,000 years ago, do you believe that? It's going to happen. Absolutely inevitable. What about this one? 174 years ago, Brother Thomas, in his own preface to the work, Help Us Israel, when Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its empire, let the reader know that the end of all things as at present constituted is at hand. Have you noted his wording? He doesn't say, you know, it's not a no-brainer. He doesn't say when Russia gets Magog and comes down and invades Israel, know that the end is near. He says when Russia starts its grand move to build up its empire. That's what Mr. Putin has done. I don't know what the future of Mr. Putin is. I really don't. But he's done that. He's started it off. Georgia, Ukraine, Kiev, Crimea, all of those areas, he's done it. Brother Thomas saw it 174 years ago. Do you believe that? I think we all do. Brothers and sisters, we've also been reminded of the frailty of life. And Brother Bruce, as we know, had a really, really, really bad bike accident last Saturday. And we've found out this afternoon and this evening that he's passed within a week. We feel for his family. Sadly, his passing was probably the best thing under the terrible circumstances of that accident. We also feel for Brother Gary Penn, who I think you know, who has a brain tumour and who is likely to live weeks, maybe months. Feel for his family too. Barring a miracle, barring Christ's intervention, his family will be husbandless and fatherless. And so we don't know our day, do we? We don't know when our day of opportunity is going to be up. Brother Bruce fully expected to get to this weekend, and he didn't. One day, our brother Gary will shake our hands for the last time. One day, Christ is going to come, and he's going to take us from this terrible, terrible world. Let's learn from the lives of our brothers. Let's learn from Dr. Thomas. Let's learn from the words of our Lord Jesus Christ and the words of Daniel, the prophet, the old man, who even though he lived in Babylon with every riches and every glory, and perhaps if he wanted it, the world's biggest bank account, said no and turned his head to Jerusalem multiple times every day in prayer to his God. So when we come to Haggai, and Haggai gives us some straight, blunt talking for kingdom preparation, this is real. Christ is coming. He's coming very, very soon. I really don't know whether it's going to be this week, this month, this year, or the next, but I know he's coming. And I know that even if he doesn't come this year, none of us know when our day of opportunity is over. So we're going to come to Haggai tomorrow morning, and Haggai's going to say, have a think about your ways. Consider how you're going. What are you doing in life? Where's your priorities? You're with God, with your world. You're doing what God wants, or you're doing what He wants. That's a timely thing to talk about right now, isn't it? In 2022, as we embark on our camp. I can't wait to share it with you and look forward to tomorrow. Thank you.